Hello, I am Steve Brooks from the Bliss Institute, and I welcome you all to our panel this afternoon. The panel is titled Party Resources. Kind of the agenda of what we will do is each of our four presenters will have about 15 minutes to present their paper and information. At the end of all of that, we will have a rather extended time for questions. And so I encourage everybody to post your questions up in the question and answer icon that's at the top of your screen. And so with those logistics set, let us get down to it. Our first presenter is Paul Harrison, and his paper title is Super PACs as a New Source of Gender Inequality in Congressional Elections. Paul?
Okay, hello everyone. I will try to share my screen and hopefully this will work. And I don't know if it's sharing what I wanted to share, is it?
I do not see it.
Well, we will give it a minute. In the meanwhile, I'd just like to just say how delighted I am to participate in this conference. I've always loved the State of the Parties conference, and I have attended and I've participated in every one of them. And now I am clicking on the open share tray, and it worked before, but it doesn't seem to be working now, which is a little frustrating. See what happens. It's amazing. This did work before. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and I'd like to thank John Green and Kim Haverkamp and everyone else at the Bliss Institute. You folks have always done a terrific job with this conference and with everything else and your institute, and I just think it's fantastic. And can people see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, this research is by Jennifer Heerwig. She teaches at Stony Brook University, and we're basically looking at the impact of super PACs on congressional elections and the gender gap. And our research questions are, do super PACs exacerbate gender-based inequalities in campaign financing and in congressional elections? And do the contributions of women super PAC donors differ from those of men? Now, when supporting conventional campaign committees, candidate committees, party committees, and traditional PACs, women typically direct most of their funds to candidates and liberal groups, and they follow what's commonly referred to as an ideological strategy. Men tend to pursue access and follow what's referred to as a pragmatic strategy. So we know that super PAC contributors are largely a political elite. And so it kind of raises a question, are women's super PAC contributions similar to women's contributions to conventional committees, or are they more similar to men's contributions to super PACs? So there's two parts to this, or two big questions here. I just want to briefly say something about types of congressional super PACs, but first, everyone knows, I believe on this, in this conference, super PACs are independent expenditure-only committees. They can raise virtually unlimited sums from contributors that conventional committees can't raise funds from, and they cannot contribute to conventional federal political committees, and they also cannot coordinate their communications with a candidate whose election they're participating in. Super PACs, congressional super PACs follow several spending strategies. There's the single candidate strategy, where the PAC tries to help a candidate and defeat the opponent. Single chamber strategy. Here, most super PACs want to influence party control, so it could be candidates for the House only or candidates for the Senate only. And then there's this combination super PAC. It helps candidates for a variety of offices, including the presidency. But to be in our data set, you cannot just be a presidential super PAC. It has to have House and Senate. In looking at support for women, we define women super PACs as those that only help women candidates, sometimes by opposing their opponents, and mixed gender PACs are ones that help men or women candidates. Now, I started to put together a slide on data. It would have taken 20, 30 minutes to go through it and several slides. Putting together the data was a ton of work, and it's described in the paper. So this figure, it gives an overview of some trends in contributions and contributors to super PACs. And on the left, you can see we're looking at the contributors. On the right, we're looking at the distribution of contributions, or really the funding to these groups. The top the top lines on both figures represent men, and the bottom line on both figures represent women. And if you look at the left, you could see by comparing the dotted and the dark lines to the lighter lines being for conventional committees, you can see that there's not much of a gender gap when you compare contributors. The gap has shrunk a little bit, but generally the gender gap for both super PAC contributors and conventional committee contributors is about 32%. When you look to the right and you look at contributions or sources of money, you can see that the gaps are very different. The gender gap for super PACs in black is huge compared to the gender gap for conventional committees, which is considerably smaller. So basically, this just shows that super PACs have not increased the contributor gender gap, but they have increased the contribution gap. One reason why? Well, women's super PAC contributions are smaller than men's. Here we just get an overview of women's and mixed gender super PACs, and you can see that when you look at the whole group of super PACs, women's groups count for about 11%. They're somewhat better represented in Senate-only super PACs that help groups of Senate candidates and in single candidate super PACs. So here we get sort of an overview of the interaction between donor characteristics and super PAC characteristics. And women are more likely to support a women's super PAC, 16% do, as opposed to men where it's 5%. You can also see that women are much more supportive of liberal super PACs and men of conservative super PACs. The affiliation of a super PAC really is really unaffected. It doesn't really affect whether women or men contribute to it. And if we look at spending strategy, the really big difference here is that women are more likely to contribute to combination super PACs than are men. So when we assess the impact, we want to assess the impact of donor and super PAC characteristics. And first we want to look at the likelihood of a contribution. And to do this, we developed something called a super matrix. And what it has is a contributor super PAC diet for each observed contribution, that is whenever an individual contributed to a super PAC, and for each potential contribution in an election cycle. So that's where an individual and a super PAC exist in the same year, participate in the same year, but the individual does not make the contribution. And this is a huge data set, 13.9 million observations, and we use logistic regression. When we look at the amount of a contribution, here we actually have only a relationship or a dyad where there's an actual contribution to a super PAC in an election cycle. And here the sample is about a little less than 31,000. We use ordinary least squares regression. The variables. The dependent variable for a likelihood of a contribution is 1 for an observed contribution and 0 for a potential contribution that was not made in an election cycle. When we look at the amount of a contribution, we just basically take the natural log of the dollar value. The independent variables, the most important one for super PACs is women's group, but also ideology is important. And we look at economic or political sector, spending strategy, financing experience. Those are all controls. For contributors, we look at their gender and sector, experience, location are really controls. And we also control for election cycle. So this figure shows the impact of gender on the likelihood of contributing to a women's super PAC over a mixed gender super PAC. And the first set of bars is for all super PACs. And here we show that women are 64% more likely to give to a women's super PAC, and men are about 38% less likely. When we look at House only or Senate only, or basically one chamber super PACs, we can see that neither group of donors is likely to contribute to a women's super PAC, and men are especially unlikely to do so. The combination super PACs, those really drive the findings for this slide. And basically, we see that women are much more likely to give to a women's combination super PAC, and men are very unlikely to. And there's probably some good reasons for that. One is these super PACs are not encumbered by a chamber-oriented strategy or by allegiance to a single candidate. They give much broader support for women's candidacies and causes, and this make them appealing to women donors. The last set of bars is for single candidate super PACs, and again, women's groups are not favored here at all, particularly by men. And there's some reasons for that too. First, there aren't that many of them. And second, contributing to one candidate is not something that many donors or a group that supports one candidate do. They might not, so super PAC donors may not like the candidate that solicits them. So they might be more inclined to give to a women's combination super PAC or even a mixed gender super PAC than a super PAC for a single candidate that does not, who does not share their views. So here we have the impact of gender on the amount of a contribution. And just a couple of points. This shows the predicted values from the OLS regressions and has all the control variables, and the other one was the also had control variables. But first you can see that overall, the amount a woman typically contributes to a super PAC is smaller than the amount a man is typically contributes. That's what the predicted values show. It also shows that women and men make their largest contributions to single candidate super PACs, followed by one chamber or single chamber super PACs, and they make their smallest contributions to combination super PACs. So these results contrast with the results for the probability of a contribution. I guess the way to interpret them is more women are likely to support combination super PACs, but the women who invest the most support single candidate super PACs. Now, here we see the impact of gender on the allocation of contributions to women's super PACs. And what we're looking at is the amount of money that women donors as a group deliver to super PACs. And, the first thing is they provide, contribute more than men. The second thing, I guess, which is pretty important to point out, is women as a group direct most of their funds to combination super PACs. And again, as noted before, this is because their broad-ranging support makes them appealing, especially for ideologically motivated donors. So how do we pull all this together? Well, first, the questions were pretty much, do super PACs exacerbate gender gaps in campaign financing in congressional elections? And do they create new gaps? So they certainly created the super PAC gap. There were no super PACs before they were formed. And here we see that only 11% of congressional super PACs are women's group. What about the participation gap, the degree to which women and men participate in campaign financing? And here they had little impact. Women are equally underrepresented among super PAC donors and conventional political committee donors. Then we look at funding gaps, and here super PACs have increased them. Women account for a smaller percentage of super PAC receipts than conventional committee receipts, and women's contributions are smaller than men's, including their contributions to women's super PACs. Now we come to the strategy gaps. Women are more likely than men to contribute to a women's super PAC, especially to a combination super PAC. Women make their largest contributions to women's single candidate super PACs, Men focus on other groups, including men's single candidate super PACs. Women allocate most of their funds to women's combination super PACs. Men certainly don't. And women are more likely than men to support liberal super PACs. So to wrap it all together, super PACs have widened the gender gap in congressional elections, and they are likely to hinder women's progress in representation, and they are also likely to hinder liberal causes. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Our next paper is by Monica Schneider, and the title is The Contribution Conundrum of Republican Female Congressional Donors.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. This is a really wonderful and exciting event. In our presentation, along with my colleague Ann Baker at Santa Clara University, is the first author. I'm presenting because Ann is due to have a baby any day, so we weren't sure if she was going to make it. So she is here, thank goodness, because she has done all the analysis on this, and any questions can go to her. So our paper is titled The Contribution Conundrum of Republican Female Congressional Donors, and the context for our paper is the dramatic increase in the number of female donors between 2012 and 2020. So women increased in their donations on the whole, although primarily these were Democratic women. So there were increases in Republican candidate contributions, but significantly more on the Democratic side. And the fact that fewer women contribute to political campaigns in the Republican Party is a well-documented trend since the 1980s. And so previous work has tried to uncover, why are there such differences between female Republicans and female Democrats, and part of it, a big part of that explanation is the structural asymmetries between the two parties, that in the Democratic Party there are much stronger donor networks and much stronger gender-focused interest groups, whereas in the Republican Party those tend to be very weak. And even sometimes there are gender-focused interest groups, and women in the Republican Party don't even know what they are. And of course, there are fewer female candidates in the Republican Party, and that makes it less appealing for female donors to contribute. So we're focusing within this context then to try to understand what motivates female donors in the Republican Party. And we're focusing on congressional donors, which is important to note because different levels of donations have different attributes. That a presidential donor is different from a congressional donor who might be different from a state and local donor. And so what congressional donors have in common across the parties, and particularly in the Republican Party, is that they prioritize ideology over other candidate characteristics. They're more politically engaged and ideologically extreme than Republicans in the electorate. And there is some evidence that female Republican donors tend to support even more conservative candidates than male Republican donors. So our question is, what motivates existing Republican female congressional donors to contribute despite these structural asymmetries? Do their policy preferences differ from male congressional donors in their party? And do those differences help explain their decision to contribute? And then how much do the policy preferences of Republican female donors differ from Democratic female donors? And what do those differences tell us about those decisions to contribute? So again, we're not looking at donations to interest groups or candidates, but we're focused on donations to Congress. So we used the CCES in 2016 and 2018, and we used, this is a first cut at the data, and we'd love to hear any feedback that people have about this, about our model decisions, but we'd used logistic models by each policy stance. So the dependent variable was predicting if you were a Republican female congressional donor versus a Democratic female congressional donor. So it's looking at the behavior of being a donor as well as the party. And then the second DV was comparing Republican females versus Republican males. So we had a bunch of different policy areas, which were our primary independent variables, looking at abortion, gun control, healthcare, immigration, environmental issues, and sexism. And a lot of these are not ordinal variables, so it's important to kind of keep that in mind when looking at the results. And then we had a number of different controls, income, ideology, etc. Our hypotheses are that there would be more moderation on some issues for female GOP donors, like healthcare and immigration, than Republican male donors, that they might be closer to Democratic females on some issues. They might be more conservative on some issues than Republican males, like feminism, where Republican women tend to be even more conservative than Republican males on some gendered issues. And then evidence that there's some evidence that gendered considerations are not as important for female Republican congressional donors, suggesting that ideological or partisan considerations are primarily driving contributions. So we're kind of just going to run through a couple slides of some of what we thought were some of the more interesting findings. And so on the top panel, these are graphs of predicted probabilities. On the top panel, we're looking at abortion issues, and this is, again, Republican versus Democratic female congressional donors. On the bottom panel, we're looking at these same issues, but comparing within GOP donors, women and men. So the largest differences here, you see that of women who support abortion only in the case of rape or incest, banning after the 20th week, or the ability of employers to decline abortion funding or decline coverage for abortions, and prohibited federal funds for abortions, that those were significantly predicted being a Republican female versus being a Democrat female. So these are issue areas that differentiate Republican women's contribution, being a Republican woman as a contributor versus being a Democratic woman. Whereas you see that people who supported always allowing abortion were much more likely to be a Democratic female. So then you see here that there are differences among women based on their party identification, where Republican women tend to align more with the GOP on these kinds of abortion issues. If we look at the bottom panel, we can compare women versus men, and this is where we see that people who oppose rape or abortion only in the case of rape or incest are much more likely to be women than men. People who oppose the rights of employers to decline abortion coverage are more likely to be women than men in the GOP. So again, we see some places where women are slightly more liberal than men in this area. Next graph, again, these are just sort of highlights of the findings. If we look at these immigration and healthcare issues, and this is looking only at women, comparing Democrat and Republican female donors, we see that women who support more border security, women who support repealing the ACA, women who support no ACA mandate or no ACA mandate plus no new taxes are much more likely to be Republican female donors compared to Democrat female donors, whereas those who oppose a DACA pathway are much more likely to be a Republican female donor. So these, again, are cases where the Republican women are aligning much more with their party than they are with, say, their gender. This slide shows some different issues, gun control and the environment, and this is comparing male and female donors within the GOP. So again, this shows some cases and some issues where women are different from men in terms of their issue positions, how their issue positions predict membership. So requiring background checks is much more likely to predict being a Republican woman versus a Republican man. Banning assault rifles, again, much more likely to predict being a Republican woman than a Republican man, and much less distinction in the environmental issues. Finally, feminism, as distaste for feminism goes up. So this is disagreeing with the idea that feminists' demands are reasonable. The probability of being a GOP woman also goes up compared to being a GOP man. So showing again where GOP women aren't necessarily motivated by what we think of as traditional women's issues in feminism. So what leads to contributing as a Republican woman? We see some cases where there's a lot of alignment with the GOP, especially on opposition to government intervention. If they oppose EPA regulation or support repealing the ACA, they're much more likely to be a Republican woman, which the exception is border security, which is a form of government intervention that they favor. There's de-alignment with the GOP on DACA, some gun control issues like background checks and bans on assault weapon, some abortion stances, but not the federal funding of abortions. And then when we look at our control variables, we see that it's not their being ideologically moderate is not significant. They're more likely to be contributing as a Republican woman if they cited religion as being very important. And these women there's no significance of being an interest group, donor, or a party contributor. So those were not significant control variables. So our tentative conclusions are that ideological asymmetries, in addition to structural asymmetries, limit the options for Republican women to contribute. So the GOP being largely homogenous in some ways doesn't leave Republican women who may have some disagreement with their party on certain issues, doesn't leave them a lot of options or places to contribute. And yet current female donors' participation is doing more to increase ideological homogeneity in the GOP than decrease. So the stronger predictions, the stronger drivers and predictions were issues that they align with the GOP on. But again, there's some heterogeneity of opinions among these very conservative women, suggesting that greater participation by more female donors could have some varying effects on the party and on congressional donations more generally. Next steps are to include additional years of the CCES, the 2012 and 2014 data, maybe reconfigure the models to examine group differences in multiple ways. And there's, some limitations with the CCES, some missing policy questions on some different kinds of issues that we would like to see and understand, like education and childcare. So it makes this kind of a difficult thing to study, but obviously really worthwhile when we think about the overall increases in donations among women over time that's leading to their importance in party politics, and to try to understand how that plays out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody adhering to the time limits. I want to remind all of you, especially the attendees, to post your questions or maybe a discussion point or something like that, because we have plenty of time for questions, and so I would like to have some that we can talk about. But our next paper is by Karen Siebold, and it is titled Empty Sets, Political Imbalance, and Partisan Asymmetry of the Federal Election Commission.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I do appreciate Bliss Institute for putting this conference on in spite of the fact that we're going through a pandemic. It's nice that they were able to host this remotely. With that being said, I'm still unable to share my PowerPoint. So what I think I'll do is just kind of talk through this, because most of my findings are preliminary anyways at this stage. So I'll just kind of talk you through some of the main points of my paper. I am certainly taking a switch here in terms of moving toward the enforcement of campaign finance regulations. Most of our panels kind of revolve around partisanship, ideology, and voting, registration, or fundraising. But I'm kind of looking at the enforcement side of fundraising and how the parties affect that. So with that being said, I'm just going to kind of move forward without my PowerPoint. I'll kind of just give you a brief overview of why I'm looking at the FEC, because it is the primary enforcer of campaign finance laws in the United States, and they are often portrayed as a failed enforcer of these laws. That's mostly because they've had several closures. In fact, between 2017 and 2020, they were closed for most of that time period, with the exception of a few months. And that occurred because they did not have enough commissioners sitting on the commissioner panel to proceed with business. It is required that there be 4 commissioners present for them to be able to proceed. So I look at the membership of the FEC panel over the last 18 years and kind of trace what's happening in terms of the confirmation process, the partisan balance, to really see how structure and partisanship is affecting the enforcement of campaign finance laws. The FEC is led by a panel of 6 partisan commissioners. They are appointed by the president, as you know, and confirmed by the Senate. And there is 6 on the panel, and no more than 3 of them may represent one party at any time. Also, 4 of them have to be present on the panel, as I mentioned just now, to proceed with most agency business. And 4 is also the number required to achieve consensus on decision-making on cases that are reviewed by the panel. And those cases are referred to as matters under review. So 4 of the 6 have to agree. Only 3 can come from one party. Therefore, they are requiring bipartisanship to move forward on any decision that the commission panel makes. And that's problematic because maintaining the 4 commissioners on the panel has been a problem. It's been a reoccurring issue over the last several years. As I just mentioned, from 2017 to 2020, the panel is effectively closed down because they only have 3 commissioners. That's not the only time it's had to close. So there's been a number of reasons on why they have a hard time maintaining 4 commissioners. Part of the problem is early exits. Commissioners leave before their term is up. But the big part of the problem appears to be untimely appointments. The president's not appointing commissioners in a timely manner, and the Senate is not confirming them. So that's led to this absence of a quorum, which is causing some problems for this very important agency. Also, many commissioners are serving on the panel well past their 6-year term. As a result of these early exits and untimely appointments, many of these commissioners will stay on well past their 6-year term out of a sense of loyalty or duty to the agency. And that is causing political imbalance. So I have a few different questions I'm interested in related to the FEC and these empty seats. I want to know how often has the panel been unable to function due to empty seats over the last 20 years. When they are able to function or meet, are they able to achieve consensus? If so, to what degree are they achieving consensus? What are they agreeing to? And are there partisan differences? So to answer these questions, I have utilized what I call commissioner sets, and I'll describe those sets in a second. And I'm looking at the decisions on the MURs that are made by the commissioner panel from December 2002 through December 2020. So my data set includes a total of 16 commissioners over that 18-year period. It also includes 3,761 unique decisions by the commissioner panel over that time span on 1,981 unique MURs or cases. That includes almost a total of 20,000 individual commissioner votes. So kind of going back to the commissioner sets, what I've done in order to analyze these votes is I've created what I call, again, commissioner sets. Every time a commissioner exits or a new commissioner enters, I am kind of creating a unique composition of commissioners or sets to analyze the data. And in total, there have been 14 sets over the last 18 years, 14 unique sets of commissioners that are making decisions. And not all those sets are the same. One of the first things about these sets is, again, the number of members on the set. You can have up to 6 members and you need 4 to be present to proceed. Of these 14 sets, 3 of them did not have enough commissioners present to proceed. And that roughly equates to about 8% of the time of my data set. There are only 4 sets of the 14 when all 6 commissioners members are present. And that does roughly equate to about 66% of the time. So 66% of the time, they've got a full slate. Most of the time, they have just enough members or they're hovering right above the 4 members that are required to proceed or vote. And so there's always kind of this threat of a quorum that may be hovering over the commissioner panel as they know that at any time, one of these commissioners that sits on the panel could exit, especially some of those commissioners that have been there for 10, 15, and 20 years. Also, partisan balance. That's kind of what I'm really interested in with the commissioner panel. And of the 14 commissioner sets, there was only partisan balance on 5 of those, where there were roughly the same number of Republicans to Democrats. Most of the time, one party over the other has controlled the majority of seats on this panel. And that's been the Republicans. They have controlled 8 of the 14 sets. In other words, they've held most of the seats, 8 of the sets. And that is around 71% of the time of my data set. Compared to the Democrats, they only controlled the majority of seats on the commissioner panel during 1 set, roughly 2% of the time. So there's definitely partisan asymmetry in terms of partisanship control of the commissioner panel. Again, you need 4 to proceed on a decision. So you don't have 4 Republicans, but you only need 3 to block a decision. So 70% of the time or more, the Republicans have enough seats to block any action moving forward on an alleged campaign finance violation. So I'm really interested in that structure, how that's playing out. We have 3 of the 14 sets where they are not able to proceed and conduct business. So I actually take those sets out for the rest of my kind of data analysis, where I'm looking at just the quorums that, or just the sets that are able to make quorum and function. And so what I look at next is kind of consensus. When they are able to meet, are they achieving consensus? And throughout those 11 sets of the 14 that are able to meet, they are achieving consensus most of the time in the earlier sets. Up till about 2008, the panel is achieving consensus, unanimous consent, 95% of the time or greater, almost 100% of the time in the earlier sets. By 2008, the middle sets, the later sets, the rate of consensus certainly begins to drop. It drops down, it's still pretty high, but it drops down to around 65% or a little more by set 8. And then in the last couple of sets, we're down to about like 65% consensus. It jumps just a little bit in the last set. So consensus is amazingly pretty high for this bipartisan commission panel, but the consensus is dropping since around 2008. And of course, since 2008, the Republicans have also controlled more of the seats on the panel. So I also look at to what degree they're agreeing, to what degree are they achieving consensus? Are they mostly achieving unanimous consensus, or a supermajority, a simple majority, or no consensus at all? And what I find is in the earlier sets, they have a little bit of a better balance in terms of simple majority versus supermajority and unanimous consent, because there are more commissioners present. By the later sets, they either have the option to agree or to disagree. So the rate of unanimous consent is actually increasing, but so is the rate of simple majority or supermajority, as well as no consensus at all. Let me back up and say actually not supermajority, simple majority, just unanimous consensus or no consensus. The rate of simple majority, supermajorities, those are starting to go away because, again, we just have the decision to agree or to disagree based on the number of seats present on the commissioner panel. This would make more sense if I was able to show my graphics. So I'll just briefly discuss what subjects they are agreeing on and what decisions they're agreeing to. So For the most part, when you look at the types of subjects that the commissioner panel is dealing with, there's roughly about 10 different cases or subjects for these cases. But only about 4 of them typically reach 5% or higher per set. In other words, most of these decisions, or subjects I should say, that are being discussed by the commissioner panel, a majority of them are they make a very small percentage of what they're discussing. Most of the cases can be put into the subject of contributions, the subject of disclaimers, the subject of foreign nationals, or the subject of reporting. Those are the 4 subjects that tend to dominate the commissioner panel throughout the last 18 years. All of the other subjects are just making up a very small percentage. So that's kind of what I focus on in my analysis. And what I find is that the commissioners are mostly agreeing on contribution cases, disclaimer cases, and reporting, but they are failing to agree on cases related to foreign nationals, which is not too surprising since that's been a rising issue in campaign finance. And what are they agreeing to in relation to these subjects? So the decisions that they actually can make on these cases can largely be put into about 5 different decision types. They're either agreeing to a factual and legal analysis of the case that has been presented to them by their own staff, kind of the facts of the case, and here's our legal argument for the case. Or they're looking at a conciliation agreement between them and the alleged violators of the campaign finance laws. They're looking at deciding on whether to find reason to believe that a violation has occurred, or they're looking to decide that there's no reason to believe a violation has occurred, or they're just looking to outright dismiss the case. And what I found is they are largely agreeing to conciliation agreements. They're largely agreeing to find no reason to believe and to dismiss the cases. But what they're not agreeing on is the factual and legal analysis, which is interesting since those are prepared by their own staff. And they're not agreeing to find a reason to believe that a violation has occurred on these cases. So those are kind of the 2 standouts, the factual and legal analysis, the reason to believe decisions. And in the process of data collection and observation, what I noticed was in the beginning, they're almost always deciding, is there a reason to believe? Is there no reason to believe? Do we approve of the factual and legal analysis? And then they would move on to dismiss, the decision to dismiss. But now they're actually skipping over those earlier steps of approving the FLA, deciding whether or not there's reason to believe or not, and going straight to dismiss. And that's likely a byproduct of the partisan gridlock that's been noted by some scholars about the agency. And so I take those 3 things, the foreign national cases, the decision to approve FLAs or reason to believe, and I look at affirmative and negative voting on what I call successful decisions, decisions that receive 4 or more commissioners agreeing, or and also failed decisions where 4 commissioners could not agree. And what I find is that for the most part with foreign national cases, those are not actually, there's not many cases related to foreign nationals for like the first part of my study. Up until about 2008, there's very few foreign national cases. And so there's no negative voting occurring. There's almost no affirmative voting occurring because there's no cases on this subject. That changes by 2008. The number of foreign national cases begins to rise, and so does the level of partisan disagreement on whether or not to approve or not agree on these cases. And there are some partisan differences. Democrats are more likely to vote in the affirmative on the cases that are successful in the middle part of the study, and by the later part of the study, it is the independents and Republicans that are less likely to vote in the affirmative on these successful decisions on foreign national cases. When it comes to the negative voting, the Democrats are voting more in the negative in the later sets than the Republicans on the failed decisions related to foreign national cases. So there's something going on there with foreign national cases that they're just not agreeing to how those cases are presented. Looking at the FLAs, for the most part, those are largely agreed to in the early part of the study. But by the middle years, by the later years or sets, there is partisan disagreement, as the Republicans are more likely to vote in the affirmative on those cases, and the Democrats are more likely to vote in the negative. So something's going on with FLAs too, even though, again, these are prepared by their own staff. There's the way those are being presented, the legal analysis of the cases. The Democrats, that's the one area of this study that they are voting more in the negative. Even though they hold fewer seats, they make up a larger percentage of that negative vote. Looking at the reason to believe decisions, those are kind of all over the board in terms of the number of reason to believe decisions throughout the study. They start out, there's a lot of reason to believe decisions early on that starts to waver and then starts to climb back up in the later sets. And there are partisan differences, as Republicans are more likely to vote in the affirmative, that there's a reason to believe, surprisingly, than the Democrats. And so I found that to be interesting. There are a couple years where they're kind of in agreement, they're in alignment, but then for the most part, in the later years, they are not. The Republicans are much more likely to be voting in the affirmative than the Democrats. Okay, with that being said, I do need to take my data and run a regression model so I can control for number of seats, partisan balance, partisan control, and also some other control factors in terms of number of the duration of the set, the number of decisions per set, which tend to be roughly pretty similar. I do find that most of the sets are hearing roughly the same number of decisions based on their duration, so I'll put that into the control model. But overall, I do find that the elected officials fail to replace these commissioners in a timely manner, and that has led to closures. It's certainly led to partisan imbalance and partisan asymmetry. And as a result of this process, the FEC is appearing to be less functional. They appear to be able to achieve consensus much less in the latter years than they were able to just 10, 15, 20 years ago. And most of that appears to, most of the rate of consensus, or the inability to achieve consensus, revolves around, again, these 4 national cases, approving the FLAs, and deciding to find reason to believe. There are certainly partisan differences that are probably going to start to flatten out once I control for the fact that the Republicans hold such a high rate of seats on this commission. There was a proposal to reform the FEC, HR 1, by reducing the number of commissioners on the panel, but I believe reducing the number of commissioners on the panel would only make things worse. And I would like to actually take my MURs, the cases, and start to code them by violation and sanction, the degree of violation, the degree of sanction, to see if there's partisan differences in what we are actually sanctioning and how we're sanctioning. So with that being said, I welcome your comments. I apologize for not being able to show my PowerPoint. So I look forward to any feedback that you might have, and perhaps I could send this to you if you are interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation. Our last but not least at all of our papers is by Anka Turco, and it is titled American Party Politics, Organizational Asymmetry, and Raising Stakes in the Competition for Votes Cast Abroad.
Can everybody hear me? Am I unmuted?
Nope, you're fine.
Okay, good. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. This is a really new conference for me. I heard how everybody was saying that they've been attending for many years. So I'm really honored because this is a first for me. And this is a first for me because I don't really come from the world of American politics. I study electoral behavior in diasporas. And what I mean by diasporas is immigrants, people who, citizens of a country who emigrate abroad and live there for a while or for the duration of their lives, and they are voting in their country of citizenship or sending countries elections. So this is my area of study. I've been studying this topic for about 5-6 years now, and I noticed that discussion of the American voters abroad really was lacking from our literature. So I really got interested in seeing and exploring more and seeing how Americans abroad vote, and finding about also about how American parties, of course, the two main parties, interact with voters abroad, with American voters abroad. And hence the paper that you will see here. That's still very much a work in progress, and I just set it up with the theoretical lens, and data collection will follow. But what I have until now, first of all, I put this first slide together just to kind of drive the importance home of diaspora voting. And these are titles taken from various media outlets about this time last year. When you see the one from Newsweek is actually from November 5th of 2020, so exactly a year ago today. And as you recall, there was a lot of talk there about who was winning Georgia, might win the presidency, and who was winning Georgia could have been very well determined by what the media was calling military ballots, but more generally, these are actually ballots coming from abroad, from military personnel and American civilians living abroad as well. So I got really excited about this when I saw all the titles and the discussion, because this is just you know what I do, and there are instances where votes coming from abroad tipped elections and decided the fate of elections. So here, these titles I have were about speculating about how the vote coming from abroad might determine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, and these the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek are about specifically votes coming into Georgia. And then I have another title down at the bottom of the slide that talks about again military votes coming from abroad, determining the outcome of the very much contested Senate election in Georgia that took place, the runoff actually took place a bit later than that. So as I said, votes cast from abroad, or as I call them, diaspora votes, have decided outcomes in various elections. If you look at the left-hand column right here, there are countries that allow their diasporas, their immigrants, to vote in national elections, presidential, legislative, in referenda. And I have the list here of countries and years when the national election was very, very close. And then a winner was declared, and that was premature because the votes came from abroad, and they tipped the election in the exact opposite direction. So the opposition actually came to win, or in some cases the incumbent was predicted to lose, and then they won because the diaspora vote gave them the very small edge they needed. So this happened in Italy. Legislative election in 2006, Romania presidential elections 2008 and 2012. It happened in Turkey in legislative elections and the referendum, and so on and so forth. I have some other cases listed here, but there are many others in the literature to be found in the literature and around the globe. So I want to put things a bit in context and discuss how actually diasporas came to vote. And this is a process that took time. It started in Australia in 1902. That country decided to give their military abroad the right to vote. And then it kind of just picked up around the world, and franchising both military abroad and just citizens who had emigrated and still wanted to, be involved in their sending countries' politics. I have in 1975, the date here noted because that's when the US set in place the current legislation to allow military abroad, but also civilians abroad to participate in elections. And I have 2021 on the slide because today, this year is the year where we actually have a record number of countries allowing their diasporas to vote. So it's unprecedented. And really countries enfranchise their diasporas because they consider this signals a commitment to democracy. Many times they also want people to see that the government of their sending country still wants to connect with them. And really there is a very little debate or conflict among parties when it comes to voting to enfranchise the diaspora. There's very few times that actually parties oppose enfranchisement. However, when it comes to actually implementing these voting rights, things are quite different because some parties kind of know that diasporas don't side with them or voters abroad don't side with them. So they try to, in a way, place limits or even sometimes sabotage the voting from abroad. And this happens when it comes to, actually implementing the voting process, or they try to set what I call these reactive limits, and it's a term from the literature, reactive limits to voting when it comes to vote counting. So they want to kind of tame the influence from diaspora voting and try to influence vote counting if it doesn't give them an advantage. And there is a substantial literature about how parties actually put in place these reactive limits to sabotage diaspora voting in many various countries, but not in the case of the US. So I really wanted to see, if what we know from the literature from other countries would apply here. And really what surprised me when I started thinking about this project and looking at the American diaspora is how unique it is. This is a diaspora where really the military matters a lot. It's a sizable part of the American diaspora, of the Americans living abroad, and it's unparalleled anywhere. We don't have any other country where, that is happening, that they have a diaspora where the military is such a big part, a big percentage of it. And really, when Americans think about the diaspora, about Americans living abroad, they think mostly about military, especially when it comes to giving them voting rights, especially when it comes to influencing elections. As I showed you on this first slide with the titles from the media, it was all about military votes. As I said, that's not really true. Those were all votes from abroad. But the American public really thinks first about military when they think about voters from abroad. The civilian diaspora has very little national visibility, and this is very different from other countries. Other countries and governments tend to really keep a focus on their diasporas. They want to keep citizens who emigrated engaged. They want these citizens to remit back home. They want them to send in investment money, to start businesses back home, maybe come back. Many governments use these citizens who live elsewhere now as a way to lobby for foreign policy purposes, other governments. So most countries have a lot tighter connection with their civilian diaspora than the US does. The US, it's almost like Americans living abroad are an afterthought or an anomaly, right? Because the US is so much the country of immigration, not of emigration. Also, what's unique about the American diaspora is the voting procedure. So in most diasporas, governments open polling stations abroad. They can open hundreds or thousands of polling stations in embassies or on other locations where they know the majority of their diaspora is located, and people go and vote in person, and then the votes are counted and the results are tallied, communicated back home. The American voting procedure, it's very convoluted. It requires registration through mail. Everything has to be really precise. The forms filled out and signatures and even stamps and dates. And it's also convoluted because every citizen votes according to the rules put in place by their last state of residence in the US and sends their vote to that state. So it's an extremely complex process, and the most complex and convoluted that I've seen of any other diaspora around the world. In terms of the so-called military vote or vote abroad being possibly decisive in the American case, that's not only the headlines that we saw in 2020. We've heard talk of this in the 2000 election, and there is an Amai and King 2004 paper that I'm going to talk about a little bit later that discusses that election. And then discussion of the diaspora tipping elections again happened in 2000. The American election happened in tipping the American election happened again in 2004, 2016. And of course, the 2020 I showed. So I'm looking at this phenomenon Through the theoretical lens of party asymmetry as discussed by Grossman and Hopkins in their 2015 paper. And this is a discussion that shows that how different Republicans and Democrats have grown in terms of their parties. The Republicans have really stuck and developed a very strong ideological orthodoxy, conformism, strict adherence to party ideology, party line, seeking small governments is very important, whereas the Democrats tend to be a lot more focused on, bringing in a lot of different types of groups of people, building a broad coalition, bringing in different social groups or different groups seeking government action for various purposes. So I took this theoretical lens and I wanted to see how it applies to these two parties in the context of diaspora voting. And I applied it to the two groups that represent the parties abroad. So we have Democrats abroad and we have Republicans overseas. And I really found that the lens of Grossman and Hopkins really explains a lot the way in which these two groups and these two parties engage with American voters abroad. So there are differences in engaging the electorate, using opportunities for fundraising, and also differences in the way in which the parties approach these reactive limits to voting that I was talking earlier about. So I'm going to look at each group real quick. Democrats abroad are really proactive in gaining support from numerous groups abroad. They have a very active website. They have very detailed information for voter registration. They're really putting in a very big effort to get American citizens, mostly civilians, registered to vote abroad. They also conduct fundraisers abroad, have instances of fundraising for Democrats in Germany, in the UK. They host campaign events abroad. We know that Hillary Clinton hosted some events in the UK at some point during her election. They have numerous Get Out the Vote initiatives, and they also have a global presidential primary that they started with their first global presidential primary in 2008. And they sent 13 delegates to the national convention since, and that is one fewer than Montana and Wyoming. So it's a pretty sizable delegation sent to the convention. Now, the Republican approach through Republican overseas is very different, but it's very reflective of what was said about party asymmetry. Republican overseas are very focused on advocacy, ideology, but not on elections. Their website is very limited in what it does. There is no registration or voting information. They don't do fundraising abroad, no campaigning, no primaries. Their focus, as I said, is to obtain some sort of goal. For example, advocacy for obtaining tax-exempt status for US citizens abroad is a big thing right now for them on their website and on their platform. They also very much rely, and I don't have this on the slide, but I thought I might as well point it out. Republicans overseas typically know and take the military vote as something that will, bolster their electoral aspirations, and they know that they don't need to do much to mobilize the military vote because the DoD does that for them. So the Department of Defense has a very good program in place where they actually take the information to the troops and they organize the troops and tell them about deadlines and actually help them through the voting process. Whereas the Democrats, who usually tend to believe that the military won't vote as much for them, but it will be the American civilians abroad that will vote for them, tend to feel that they don't, of course, they don't have that and they need to organize the vote themselves. Now, one last point I want to make, and this is about the Republicans embracing what I call reactive limits on diaspora voting. And this happens a lot, and it's documented most importantly in the Imai and King paper I was talking about from 2004 that discusses how in the 2000 elections, Republicans brought lawsuits to disqualify certain votes arriving from overseas in Democratic strongholds. Of course, in Florida, that was the the hotbed for hot contestation and lawsuits then. And then they also filed lawsuits to allow the same type of votes coming from abroad in Republican strongholds. It was a very partisan kind of decision on lawsuits, but it did bring the desired outcomes, because the election then was won by 537 votes. And had the Republican Party not taken these lawsuits to disqualify votes from abroad in Democratic strongholds and to qualify or to allow the votes in their Republican strongholds, the result might have been different. And similar lawsuits or actions. Sorry?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay, I just have one last point. So similar lawsuits or actions have been mostly promoted by Republicans in the 2004, 16, and 2020 election. And the Democrats have been known to try similar actions when it comes from to voting from abroad in the year 2000, but as famously explained by Joe Lieberman in November 2000 on the Meet the Press interview, the Democrats are very reticent to take on or launch lawsuits against votes coming from abroad because they are really worried about being perceived as anti-military. So that's why they are not as likely to embrace this kind of reactive limit approach, launch through lawsuits as Republicans do. So yes, thank you for listening, and this is my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Speaking of questions, I'm looking here at my little group of questions, and I have none. So I encourage those of you in attendance, if you'll type up a few questions, and can do that. In reading these papers before, I did have some thoughts, and so we'll start with those and hope our colleagues will hop on board with questions, and if not, we'll have some roundtable discussion. I think my first question really relates to the two papers on female participation, mainly through fundraising, but depending on how you think about it, some might suggest that the nature of at least female candidates in elections has been moving in what I guess we'd call a positive direction. I think Paul's presentation started out with pretty much over time flat lines in terms of some of the things he was thinking about. Do you see that there's any changes coming about on the electoral side that would actually shift the patterns that you found on the campaign contribution side? I think you're muted. There we go.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So, I think, there are some trends in campaign finance that have worked out well for female candidates. They, at least on the Democratic side, raise just as much as men, if not more. I had a couple of colleagues and I have a study that shows that women allocate their money very similar to men, but the downside is they have to, in many cases, spend more to get the same bang for the buck. So what And all of that is taking place within the well-regulated area of campaign finance. The super PAC situation, which is not as rigorously regulated or has fewer regulations, is one where anyone or any group can spend virtually or contribute virtually an unlimited amount to a super PAC or even spend it themselves. And that has not worked to the advantage of women candidates. There's just less money there from women supporters and much less money spent for them. So I see two sides here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also worth thinking about to what extent are female candidates going to draw in female donors. I mean, there's not necessarily always going to be a link there. And I think that's important to note. And I think there is also kind of this understudied area between not just raising money from super PACs and how that affects the race, but maybe how super PAC rhetoric might be more negative towards female candidates, or to what extent do super PACs feel like they can jump into a race with a female candidate because they might perceive her as being weak, and so they might generate more funding or more negative campaign rhetoric around that. I also think it just kind of popped into my head just kind of how the pandemic might be affecting female donors. So we've seen this big increase. I wonder to what extent, I mean, have women, who are kind of have mixed feelings about what's happening in the workforce right now, who might be dropping out of the workforce, but who also might be more attuned to some of the politics of childcare with the pandemic. I wonder if that'll affect either their political participation in different ways. And I'm eager to see what that looks like and what research along those lines can tell us about that.
Thank you. I guess my comment has presented us with a couple of questions. The first one is for Paul. Are there differences in male-female candidate super PACs usage of 501c4 donors as opposed to individual person donors? Paul?
Did he freeze? He looks frozen.
Okay, why didn't we come back to that one, and then we will go one for Karen.
Yeah, I do. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
501c4 groups are under IRS jurisdiction, but give to super PACs. The donors of 501c4s are anonymous, and so the 501c4s are effectively straw donors. Have the FEC members argued over what they can do about this?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there is definitely kind of an interesting shell game that's happening here as this money is kind of passed back and forth between the 501cs and the super PACs, and they're not both regulated by the same entity. Well, the FEC was effectively closed down from 2017 to 2020. So there really hasn't been anything happening at the FEC. And since 2020, December 2020, when Trump finally got around to appointing 3 members to the FEC, right after the election, it was really timely. They're trying to play catch up. So they're just trying to get through the backlog, and having these types of issues, these types of issues aren't generally just kind of discussed unless there is some issue brought to them, a case that is brought to them. Looks like Paul's trying to get in. Okay, great. So I have not seen anything on how to trace the 501c donors and how to track whether or not they're giving to the super PACs. That's really difficult to do because the laws allow that to be difficult. You don't have, super PACs don't theoretically have to show the origins of the donation. So it's very hard to trace. And I don't see any discussion currently about that. Right now, if there is time for discussion beyond catching up on the case backlog, it has actually been revolving around like, when to get rid of cases, how to dismiss cases. Do we need everyone to agree to dismiss the case, or if we can't agree, can that case just be dismissed? So right now they're really discussing kind of structural issues, voting process issues, and they really aren't. I'm not seeing a lot of this discussion yet, and I have been fortunate because during the pandemic, the meetings did go online of the FEC Commission meetings, and so I've been able to watch those when they do occur, for the most part, when they're not closed off to the public. But I haven't seen any discussion on this, and I don't foresee any discussion on this because of the makeup of the FEC. Again, is largely Republican dominated and is now Trump dominated in terms of the appointments. So I will keep an eye on this, and it might be something to kind of spend some time thinking and writing about. But yeah, don't see that happening anytime soon. Hope that answers the question.
Before we go, Anka, is there a possibility that you could share your screen? And Paul,
I didn't think it was shared anymore. Sorry about that. Let's see.
I don't know. Are the rest of you?
Okay.
Yeah, there it goes.
Oh,
There.
I apologize.
No,
Well,
no
I
problem.
wasn't seeing. I was seeing all of you. I wasn't seeing my. I wasn't seeing my slide. Sorry about that.
Paul, did you hear the question, or were you frozen at that time? Unmute, please. There we go. All right. Oh, no.
One more time. There we go.
There. Were you able to hear the question, or should I repeat it?
That would be great if you could repeat it, because I got totally knocked off.
Okay. Are there differences in male/female candidate super PACs usage of 501c4 donors as opposed to individual person donors?
I do not have an answer to that offhand, but I think we could easily find out by going to the Center for Responsive Politics website. They pretty much have that kind of information there. There isn't also that much dark money at super PACs that I can confirm. You know, there's not that many super PACs that accept it.
I have another question here. Oops. Uh-oh, somehow those two questions.
They're under the published. If you go to
okay,
published,
there we go.
you
Okay.
can see them.
For gender and sexuality studies papers, have there been considerations on how certain resources might be more useful for women candidates as technology improves?
I mean, I can't think of any research that really addresses that directly. I'm just trying to think of kind of the women in campaigning literature about, you know, whether or not women are better at that. The way technology can either enhance the ability of women candidates to highlight things that they want to highlight. I mean, I think that there's some work by Kim Fridkin that suggests that women candidates don't, like the media doesn't always reflect the kind of campaign that women candidates want to run accurately. So I wonder if some of that technology might help women talk more directly to voters and get their message across. But I can't think of anything that really addresses that directly. Can you, Paul?
I really can't. It's a great question. I guess you know, who would distribute that information would be Emily's List in their training sessions. So I don't know, but I think I agree in general with Monica's direction that the ability to communicate directly to voters probably works to the advantage of female candidates.
well, there's so many training organizations now that are, I can't keep them all straight, and they all have generic names that are giving. Yes, yeah, she should run. A lot of different ones.
All right. I have one here, Veronica. How many votes were there in 2020 from abroad? Are there good estimates, or do they have to be aggregated across states? Also, how does the US compare with other countries in the percentage of votes coming from the diaspora?
Very, very good questions. Thank you. The answer is there is no clear answer. And that is the big frustration here, because as you implied there, it's all data and information scattered across 50 states. And what we're working on right now is we don't even have anywhere a clear representation of which states have what rules and what deadlines. So that's my project right now with my research assistant, to actually put together a list of every state and what the deadlines and the procedures are for voters abroad. And then to actually get the information on votes and how many votes came in, and it's every state you start from zero, because the procedure is different. Some have them, some don't have them, so some don't really bother to keep count. So it's very difficult to know. The estimate number of Americans who live abroad who have a right to vote is about 9 million. And out of that, it can be anywhere between 7 to 10% estimate that vote. But again, they're very kind of ballpark numbers. And this is not only the US, really. There are many countries who have this problem. There are many countries who don't really know how many of their citizens actually live abroad, especially in Europe, where the borders are open and everybody can kind of come and go. And there's no like system keeping track of EU citizens, where they are today and where they are tomorrow. And so it's not an atypical thing for a country not to really have much in terms of very clear information of how many people abroad and how many are voting, unfortunately.
A question that I had piggybacks on it, and it probably is the same answer, and says we really don't know. But my sense from what you said is that there would be more in those states that have large military person, in the diaspora. Absolutely. But also, I would guess Virginia and around Washington, D.C. probably would have a relatively high non-military because they
diplomats
back up from D.C. to go abroad. But other than that, is there any other sense of how that distribution might happen?
In terms, I think also states that have a lot of economic clout, California, New York, who actually have people who move abroad for business. So it's those states, then of course the military states, and then yes, diplomats around Virginia, DC. Yeah, those would be best represented among, abroad. I can't hear you.
Audience, do you have any more questions, and/or colleagues? Presenters, do you want to engage in some questions among yourselves?
I just have a few comments. I think these were great papers. I learned something I've learned more than something. I learned quite a bit from all of them. Karen, you just gave me more reasons to believe that the FEC is dysfunctional and will always stay that way. And I was lucky enough to have her slides, and it's a great presentation. Monica, I'm curious if you can connect election data to your data set. So whether having an incumbent challenger race or an incumbent who holds an institutional position of power, open seats affects Republican women's fundraising, if they respond the same as Democratic women and Republican men. And Anya, I've done a little work in that area, and you really have a tough project to do because there are a lot of moving parts. There's a non, and it's so complicated in the United States that, and the government doesn't do very much, the federal government, that some nonprofits have popped up that do a lot of the work. One of them used to be called the Overseas Vote Foundation and is now called US Vote. And they basically help UOCAVA voters navigate the system, and they survey these voters as well. And one year, I did a research project with them, and we took a look at the impact of different types of communications in getting citizens to use new ways of vote, citizens abroad to use new ways of voting, and that also included military citizens at home. And it was really complicated, but it was really fun to do, and we had some good findings, and they were Overseas Vote Foundation then, but US Vote Foundation now was a good partner.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to make a couple comments. Thank you, Paul, for making your comment about my study. I appreciate that. I've been working on the FEC data now for the last few years, and was really surprised to just see the partisan imbalance on that commission that's supposed to be bipartisan, which I'm sure, there's all kinds of interesting things to get into with that. But I was really surprised to see that Trump waited 3 years to make his appointments, because he could have dominated. It could have been a complete domination by President Trump of the FEC commission, because the other 2 seats that he did not replace, he could have, because these commissioners have sat on the commission well past their 6-year term. They're at, like, Ellen Weintraub's at like 18, 20 years. The independent commissioner, Stephen Walther, he's been on there for like 16, 18 years. So had Trump not gotten so obsessed with overturning the election, he actually could have nominated 2 more people to the FEC bench and had an entire slate. But he still has 4 on there, 4 appointments, 3 that are Republican. And again, that's all he needs to be able to block investigations. If I would have had my PowerPoint, I would have went into a little more about some of the political tactics that have also been utilized, especially by President Bush. You're only required, you only are not allowed to have more than 3 members from one party, but you don't have to seat those 3 members. And we saw Bush actually seat an independent in place of a Democrat. And that has really just thrown off the partisan balance ever since. And also President Bush dominated nominating those commissioners to the bench. I think of the 16 commissioners, he had nominated 8 of those. So it was kind of interesting. I didn't have a chance to really get into those political tactics. But I started this research a few years back looking kind of at budgets, and I had some encouragement from you, Paul, that kept me working on this. I did want to just mention that I think, though, for Paul, for your paper, and Monica, I am interested in looking at how the fact that super PACs are not unlimited or are not limited, and parties, PACs, and other giving entities are, how does that affect things? I think that perhaps the gender cap would shrink if super PACs were also limited like the other giving entities, but they're not. And so I feel like that is also exacerbating the gender gap, the fact that super PACs are allowed to give unlimited amounts, and they're going to give those unlimited amounts to the male candidates versus the female. If they were limited, or if the parties were unlimited, perhaps, maybe it's not that we need to limit the super PACs, but we need to unlimit the parties. The parties tend to give to challengers more than the other entities. If the parties were able, they might support more of these female challengers. Just kind of throwing that out there.
So you're thinking of the gender of the candidate rather than the gender of the donor.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about the gender of the candidate, but
interesting.
The gender of the donor as well. I'm not advocating for limiting or unlimiting either, but
right.
What I've seen is that when super PACs are unlimited and parties are limited, females are going to receive, challengers are going to receive less support. And perhaps, there would be something there to the donor side as well.
I mean, I'd have to think about that I wouldn't anticipate there being much difference in the gender gap from the donor side, just because I would think that the resource gap between men and women would recreate no matter what the limitations are, unless if it's unlimited, you have men who just give so much more that on average, like the sort of super male donors that bring up the average, and maybe that those would go away, and so then maybe the average for men would decrease. I don't know, Paul, do you have any thoughts?
I agree with you, Monica. I think when we look at the distribution of super PAC dollars, there is a big gap between the amounts that women and men give, men giving much more, and it's much bigger than the contribution gap for the regulated money. And when you look at the actual cases of donors, the largest or the ones who give the most tend to be men. One of the issues with super PACs, like any other group, is they're very narrow in focus, with the exception of the ones that are connected to the party committees. And so they just can plunk a lot of money in one race or many races, whereas political parties and federated groups, federated traditional PACs, they get all sorts of pressures from all sorts of donors, and they spread their money much more widely. You know, that single candidate super PACs, they've got one goal, one focus, and they usually only last one cycle, whereas political parties live longer and face all sorts of internal and contributor pressures to spread their money around. It's a great question.
With limits, though, we might be able to limit their brightness. They're like stars, those single candidate super PACs. They burn hot, they burn bright, and then they burn out. Limiting them would kind of take down the brightness a little bit. Yeah. You know, so I just think there's something to the limits, the lack of limits on super PACs that allow that gender gap to move forward. Exacerbates it.
I have a quick question for Karen. You mentioned that break between 2017 and 2020 for the FEC not functioning at all. Is that unprecedented?
Well, I'm just looking at the last 20 years, but from what I have observed from the previous 20 years, because the FEC's only been around since the 1970s, is that they did not have that problem with membership. I did not trace the membership for the entire, since the origins of the agency, but I have not read about, I have not seen the same issues. Now, I did go back and see that there's always been politics played with the nomination process, but not to the degree that it left the commission without a quorum. And so that's a great tactic of the politicians who oversee the agency to disable it. Just don't seat the commissioners. After all, they're the ones that are going to be regulated by the commission. They're going to be the primary targets of these investigations, along with the other, parties, PACs, entities out there. But, certainly it is to their advantage. It's rational for them to disable the agency. So I believe that really starts to heighten in the 2000s. Again, I start to see the tactics out with President Bush in terms of not seating a Democrat, placing an independent instead, or placing a Democrat in name only. One of the nominees in the early 2000s fought against Citizens United, fought for Citizens United, fought against BICRA, and he was placed as a Democrat on the FEC commission. Now, ultimately, his nomination was not confirmed. He was a recess appointment. He was not confirmed. But there's been a few tactics like that, and there's been some back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats on the confirmation process, really in 2008 and 2010, 2012. And it's just gotten to the point where it's just been completely disabled, which is really problematic for enforcing most of the violations that are going to be made about campaign finance are going to be brought to the FEC. There's other entities. You could go to the Justice Department, the FBI, but those aren't the entities that are going to receive these complaints and cases. So yeah, that's why I really want to look at the level of the violation that is being alleged and the type of sanction that is, if any, that is put on these cases, to see are they getting caught up on the lower hanging stuff, the easy stuff, the lesser violations, or are they getting caught up on the more serious violations, which is more likely, I expect.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we're running out of time. All of you at the very beginning thanked the Bliss Institute for putting this together and all of that, but I think one of the reasons that it has maintained that prestige it has is that the people that come and give papers take us very seriously and provide all of us with the chance to be challenged and charged. And so I want to, in return, thank you for making the conference such a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everybody.